Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/The Rob Burgess Show. Over 250,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I am, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 22nd episode, our guest is Jeff Smith. But before we get to that, I need to take a moment to tell you about our sponsor. For you, the listeners of the Rob Burgess Show podcast, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. A book I would personally recommend, which pertains to this episode, is Mr. Smith Goes to Prison: What My Year Behind Bars Taught Me About America's Prison Crisis, written and read by today's guest, Jeff Smith. Whatever book you pick, you can exchange it at any time, you can cancel at any time, and the books are yours to keep. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/The Rob Burgess Show. Again, that's audibletrial.com/The Rob Burgess Show for your free audiobook. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review everywhere the podcast is available. Whether it's iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Facebook, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, or RSS, you can find links to everything on the official website, www.therobburgessshow.com. You can also find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. Back to today's show. Jeff Smith starred in the 2006 documentary, Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington Anymore?, and was a Missouri State Senator from 2007 to 2009, representing the city of St. Louis. After serving a year-long sentence at FCI Manchester for obstruction of justice, he then worked as an assistant professor at the New School's Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Planning. He is the author of Mr. Smith Goes to Prison: What My Year Behind Bars Taught Me About America's Prison Crisis, and Ferguson in Black and White, an ebook exploring the roots of the racial tension in Ferguson, Missouri. He is now the Executive Vice President at Concordance Academy of Leadership, which is dedicated to reducing reincarceration by providing evidence-based, holistic services to justice-involved adults returning to the community after prison. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeff Smith MO, that's JEFFSMITH, capital M, capital O. And now on to the show.
This is Jeff.
Hey, Jeff, it's Rob.
Hey, Rob. How's it going?
Good. How are you, man?
I'm good.
Oh, good. I'm glad we finally got to talk here. This is very exciting.
Yeah. Thanks for reaching out. Appreciate it.
No problem, man. Well, just before we get going here, just let people know whatever you want them to know about you.
So, I'm Jeff Smith, and I used to be a political rising star. No longer. Now I'm the Executive Vice President at Concordance Academy, a new reentry organization in St. Louis that aspires to be the most comprehensive organization in the world serving people coming out of prison.
Now, you're from St. Louis. I've only been through St. Louis, and of course I wrote a lot about the Ferguson situation that happened. Just kind of give people a lay of the land of St. Louis for those of us who didn't grow up there.
Okay, so as a lot of people know who followed the Ferguson situation, it's one of the most segregated cities in the country. A lot of that stems from the divide between the city and the county. St. Louis City split off from St. Louis County in 1876, And actually the population of St. Louis City, it was once the fourth largest city in the country, but has lost about two-thirds of its population, nearly two-thirds of its population in the last half century. So about the same percentage that Detroit has lost. So the city itself has suffered a great deal. The county has grown some, but the metropolitan area as a whole has kind of stagnated over the last few decades. So it's a city that's lost a lot of jobs in the wake of deindustrialization. It used to be the second largest maker of cars in the world, and that also is not true anymore. So it's a city that I think has a lot of potential. It's got the bones of a world-class city because it was once one of the biggest cities in the country. Beautiful architecture, beautiful museums, and gorgeous parks. And hopefully I will be a part of, kind of the nascent revitalization of the city.
Right. And I just finished watching the documentary that you were the star of, Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington Anymore? Actually just finished that today, and I just finished the book today, so I've actually been thinking about you a lot. So,
so you know a hell of a lot more about me than I know about you.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm a journalist. I live in Kokomo, Indiana. I have this podcast, obviously. Anything else you want to know, you can ask me. So I almost think you should sell that documentary as a 2-pack with the book, because that's actually, as soon as I read the book, I was like, okay, I got to see this movie now, because you were describing all the people in it, and you do get to see a little bit of St. Louis in that documentary. So how did you feel?
A lot of St. Louis. Every day during both my congressional race and my state Senate race, I canvassed every single day. That was something that we did not compromise on. No matter what else was going on in the race, we wanted to kind of stay in touch with people at the doors and what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and it was my favorite part of the campaign. You can, I think, probably tell that when you watch the film how much I loved that, and that really, my first campaign in particular, we didn't really have any other way to get known because I was a total unknown running against the son of the governor. His dad was governor. His mother was a U.S. senator. And so he was, had essentially universal name identification, and I started with almost none. And so the doors were really the critical way to spread the word in that race.
Yeah. And in that race, as the movie shows, you are kind of going up against a establishment that is pretty entrenched in the Carnahan name. Just tell people who don't know how big the Carnahan name is in Missouri. I mean, it's a powerhouse, right?
Yeah, I mean, as the kind of leading political scientist who follows elections here in St. Louis said in the film, the Carnahans are to Missouri like the Kennedys are to Massachusetts, sort of the leading political dynasty. And the scion of that dynasty back in 2004 was Russ Carnahan, my opponent. So, he, in our first poll, he had 99% name ID. I had 3% name ID. So we started a long way behind, but I had these amazing volunteers. I know it's kind of a cliche at this point to say you ran a grassroots campaign, but before we could raise any money, we put together several hundred volunteers, ultimately 700 people, most of whom went canvassing for us day in, day out. And, conversely, Carnahan didn't really have any grassroots organization at all, but and so that really was what distinguished us every day. Our campaign became known by the fact that we would jog between doors. It was something I did instinctively just to want to hit more doors, and I started doing it, and then my body guy who walked with me, of course, had to do it, and then my intern started doing it. And then once the interns started doing it, when they canvassed with me, they spread it to the volunteers, and it sort of became the sort of a trademark for us. And I think it highlighted kind of the energy that I hope to bring to representing the district.
Mm-hmm. And it's so, I mean, you came so close in the end, right? It was like 1,500 votes, is that right?
Yeah, it was about just a little bit more than 1%.
Wow. And he didn't even win a single place, right? He just came in second and third, and somehow he still won through just massing all those votes. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was a 10-way primary, and you're right. He didn't win in any section of the district, but he ran second pretty much everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so even though I won St. Louis City comfortably, I won St. Louis County, I lost by so much in the rural section of the district that it enabled Carnahan to kind of slide by me at the end of the night around 3 or 4 a.m. If you watch the documentary.
Right. And it seems like there's a lot of tension with the local media as far as the coverage of your campaign. Especially, I'm going to say the editorial boards seem to not come out for you. What do you make of that? Just because they know the Carnahan situation better, so it's like maybe they can win easier. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it was the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which is the main paper in the city. They got angry, not angry, but they thought I was over the top, was their exact quote, because it was 2003, 2004. I thought the war in Iraq was an abomination, and I said so, every day at the top of my lungs that we needed to get our troops out immediately. That was in direct contrast to the views of our congressman at the time, Congressman Dick Gephardt, who was a staunch supporter of that war, walked out in the Rose Garden with President Bush. And so I took issue with that, and that kind of got me crossways with a lot of the big, opinion makers in the city at that point. Since then, of course, a lot of people have kind of come around to the view that Iraq was a misguided war. But at that point, particularly because of Congressman Gephardt's support of it, feelings were pretty mixed at that point.
Yeah, and I think people forget just how radical a statement that was in that time, because there was such, a fever of war in the air, and people were just, chomping at the bit, and, it was a really scary time in a lot of ways. But it's funny that both Hillary Clinton now and Donald Trump are both running away from any support of the Iraq War, when at the time it was like your position was not the, it seemed like, I see people in the film kind of taken aghast that you're saying these, like, he's too wild saying these things, but now, like, that's the mainstream view, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
that was a bad idea.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, there were two main papers in the city. One of them was Post-Dispatch, the mainstream paper, and then we have a very highly regarded and award-winning black newspaper called the St. Louis American. With that paper, I was told by the publisher I was very close to getting their endorsement. He said they were 98% sure they were going to do it, but then at the last second, a group of African-American politicians in the area, many of whom had been appointed to different positions or had allies who had received judicial appointments or other appointments from Carnahan's father when he had been governor, decided to push for the paper to endorse Carnahan, and so they reversed themselves at the last moment and decided not to endorse me. So you're right. Losing both of those endorsements, definitely was, I think, an inflection point, kind of against me in the race.
Yeah, for sure. And you can't help, being so close, if it was a blowout, it doesn't even really matter. But, it was so close that it's like... Anytime
you lose by 1%, you can point to almost anything.
Right, exactly. Yeah, for sure. So, you narrowly lost that. Now... Citizens United hadn't happened yet.
Correct.
And we see, it locally here in Indiana, of course, we've seen before Governor Pence joined the Trump ticket, he got his most significant, donations from this big money situation that we have now in campaign finance. Do you think the scenario of the grassroots person is more or less likely now than it was when you ran for the seat?
Well, I think now, really, in particular on the Democratic side, but I think to some extent on the Republican side, we've seen the rise of grassroots donors that have really kind of risen up thanks to the instant nature of online fundraising, to show that if you can get, like Bernie Sanders did, millions of people excited about your campaign, it's possible to raise money in, small dollar contributions. And so I actually think the advent of a lot of the technology around politics has made it a little bit easier for candidates to spread the word about their race and raise money. We didn't have Twitter when I was running, and Facebook was limited to like Harvard and Yale maybe, but we were just beginning to do a little bit of online fundraising using email, but we didn't have most of the tools at our disposal. So while I think Citizens United and free speech now, both Supreme Court decisions have definitely facilitated the ability of mega wealthy people, billionaires to influence races. The response to that from grassroots donors around the country has been pretty encouraging, and I think the Sanders campaign showed that it's possible to raise as much as the establishment candidates that are backed by the billionaires, if you can truly mobilize the masses.
Right. I'm trying to remember the name of the congressman who was primaried, who was like the number 2, Eric Cantor.
Yeah.
Right. So he totally got usurped in the primary because he had an upstart Tea Party candidate. And he was the number 2 guy in the House, right? I mean, he was.
Yeah, I mean, he had a couple $1 million, and he lost to a guy, who barely had any money at all, but who had, a couple issues against him, and a grassroots following. So, I think that it's easier. Yes, the cynics would say it's easier than ever to pump up, millions of dollars of dark money into a campaign, using the kind of sketchy parts of the tax code, these like 501c4s, to disguise the sources of money and then funnel them into races without any accountability or transparency. On the other hand, it's also easier than ever to use social media to spread the word about a race and to mobilize people to both canvass, make phone calls and also contribute. So, I'm actually optimistic. I think this year, we saw the establishment be seriously threatened on the Democratic side because of the Sanders movement, and be taken down on the Republican side, despite the fact that Jeb Bush had raised $100 million from, the 1% in this country. So I think it was kind of actually an encouraging year so far for people who are opposed to just, the special interests.
So you narrowly lost that to Russ Carnahan, but give us a rundown of what happened in that campaign that got you into trouble.
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to do it in 60 seconds. It was about 3 weeks from the end of my congressional campaign, and a guy approached 2 of my aides. He told them that he wanted to put out a postcard highlighting my opponent, Mr. Carnahan's dismal attendance record in the State House of Representatives. And my aides came to me and said, what should we do? This guy wants to put out a flyer about Carnahan's attendance record, but he doesn't know all the details about it. Should we give him that information? And I knew the information was publicly available, but I didn't really think through the consequences. And so I said to my aides, look, I don't want to know what you do. Just don't tell me any details. Which was basically telling them, yeah, make sure the guy gets the information. And so they did. A couple weeks later, I didn't think this third-party guy was going to actually do anything. He billed himself as a practitioner of the political dark arts, he was kind of a shady guy, but I didn't think he was actually going to put out any postcard. So I called a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse and said, Russ Carnahan, my opponent's a nice and decent man from a wonderful political family, but the guy doesn't show up for work, so we shouldn't vote for him. The next day, the shady practitioner of the dark arts puts out a postcard saying the exact things that I had said the day before publicly. And he had used the information that he had gotten from my 2 aides to put out that postcard. Now, it was all factual, and it was all publicly available information, but he received it from my aides, which constituted illegal coordination under the McCain-Feingold, campaign finance reform statute. A few days later, I lose the election by 1%. Carnahan files a complaint against me with the Federal Election Commission alleging that there was illegal coordination between my campaign and the third party, and I signed an affidavit saying I didn't have any advanced knowledge of that postcard, which wasn't true because I knew that my aides had met with the guy who I figured probably put it out. I justified that to myself by saying that I told my aides not to tell me any details, but 5 years later, my best friend wore a wire for 2 months and got me to admit that this rationalization wasn't true. And so when the feds closed in on me, basically I had a choice of, if I would have worn a wire on people higher on the food chain than me, that was really my only chance to stay out of prison. I decided not to do that and was ultimately sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison for obstruction of justice, stemming from that, from covering up that original campaign finance violation.
Yeah, and as you describe in the book, you then ran, we should say, for a later seat, which you then won in the Missouri State Senate, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you did eventually get into office, but this followed you around from.
It followed me around for 5 years.
Wow.
And I served in the Senate for 3 years. I loved every minute of it. Had a wonderful tenure. Was able to pass a lot of legislation, ironically enough, around criminal justice reform, which was a passion of mine, and then never really anticipated just how intimately acquainted I would become with the criminal justice system.
Right. But you describe in the campaign to get that seat where somebody that was running against you did something very similar to what you did, but nothing came of it because you didn't file a complaint. Is that right?
That happened in both my campaigns.
Oh, wow.
In both my campaigns, my opponents, one of them, they constantly insinuated that I was gay and had postcards screaming, "Jeff Smith won't be straight with us," because I was single at that point. And then in a second campaign, there's a lot of anti-Semitic material put out, postcards that had a Star of David and a picture and that said, "Who will Jeff Smith really represent? North St. Louis or Israel?"
Wow. Those are sheriff stars. Don't worry about it. It just kind of wasn't my. I never filed an FEC complaint, so there wasn't really any action about the other ones, even though they also lacked. Just as the postcard that was put out in coordination with my campaign lacked that requisite paid for by disclaimer on bottom. Wow. Yeah, it just seems like something that happens all the time in campaigns, it just seems like it somehow fell onto you. Do you seem to think that people that were in the government or whatever that were going after you kind of wanted to? You called it kind of headhunting, I think. They wanted to go after somebody big. Like somebody that was public. So you had been in a movie, you were in the Senate, you were a very visible person. Do you think that they just wanted to make an example of you because you were who you were?
Yeah, I think that was part of it. Prosecutors are human like anyone else, and many of them are very ambitious. And, to the extent that landing a bigger scalp helps them advance and gain prominence, I think a lot of prosecutors are susceptible to that instinct. So, look, I made a mistake. I screwed up, and I paid the price for it. But the incentive structures for prosecutors in this country, many of whom, are interested in taking down a big fish, is something that I think we should all pay a little more attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. You were sent to prison for a year, right? But you got good time for how does it work? You get a day for a day?
You do 85% of the time in the federal system. So you can get 15% of your time taken off as long as you don't get in any fights or, do anything, any egregious misbehavior.
For sure. So you have this great scene near the beginning of your time in prison where this one prisoner named Cornbread confronts you. I just want to read from the book real quick because it just made me laugh so hard. You were sitting with people that were not of your race at a lunch table, right?
Correct.
And then this person named Cornbread basically calls you an N-word lover. And then you said, no, I said, figuring it wasn't the opportune time to reveal my African American Studies paper. That made me chuckle a bit. But that's something that struck me right away, and I've always kind of thought about, because I'm not a racist, but I always hear that prison is such a racially segregated place, and whether you like it or not, you have to, as you say, ride in your car or whatever with people that are of your own race. For the most part, there are exceptions, of course, as you say. You're somebody that has gone out of your way to reach out to the black community. I mean, that's true up and down. Like you're in probably the 1% of people that have tried to reach across racial barriers, and here you are in a place that is more racially segregated than anywhere. How did you deal with that? I mean, how did you justify that in your mind? I mean, it was survival, I'm sure, on a certain level, but.
Yeah, no, it was definitely challenging. As you said, so I'm a white guy. I was a Black history major in college, and then started a group of charter schools that were almost 100% Black, and was very active in the Black community and a lot of my community service, and then ultimately represented a majority Black state Senate district. And so I was very interested in racial justice and causes that were important, to St. Louis's Black community, which, as everybody understands, after Ferguson, has suffered a great deal from historical discrimination in this area. So, yeah, it was not easy to go to prison and have such a stark line divide whites from blacks at the table in the chow hall, and really in the entire, on the weight pile, when people are working out, on the yard. Prison is probably the most segregated part of America. So as you read from, in the scene that you read from the book, I was kind of in for a rude awakening. I sat at the lunch table with Black guys who were in my cell block my first day, and received a warning from kind of the white, shot caller, if you will, who warned me that if I did that, it was not going to be taken well by the white gang members at the prison. So in any case, tried to kind of navigate that for over the course of my year in prison, and thankfully was able to do it without getting crossways with too many people.
Sure. Yeah. There's another scene that you encounter some white guy with his shirt off, and he has AB on his chest, and you're like, "Oh, Anheuser-Busch, I'm from St. Louis," and he's like, "No, Aryan Brotherhood." It's like, oh my.
What he said was, he said, "Welcome home, brother." And when I saw the AB, I naturally thought, "Oh, Anheuser-Busch, he must be from St. Louis." Yeah. No. The units where people lived were very segregated, and at first I was part of the only interracial cell at Manchester FCI, but ended up getting into a little bit of a scrape with my cellie, and had to move.
I see. Yeah. Now, speaking of segregation, segregated housing, or the SHU, or solitary, whatever you want to call it, that I watched. I think you mentioned this documentary in the book, but there's a National Geographic documentary about solitary confinement. That's the one you mentioned, right? I believe.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that years ago, and that blew my mind. It just seems like so. I mean, if we're talking about cruel and unusual, that is the definition of cruel and unusual. And people become more impulsive and more self-destructive, and of course they do, because if you hold people, off to like that with, it's psychological torture. So, I mean, just explain the shoe for people that don't know what we're talking about.
Well, the shoe is a key tool for social control from the prison's perspective. If anybody, misbehaves seriously, if they get caught stealing, if they get in a fight, if they get caught with contraband or a shank or a cell phone, anything like that, then the prison will send them to the shoe for anywhere from a few weeks to several years. And, a lot of people live most of their life in prison, some people decades even in solitary confinement. This was first tried by the Quakers in Philadelphia in one of the early American prisons, and the Quakers realized they originally thought it would be a way for people to sort of express penitence, to be by themselves and think about what they had done wrong. But what they found is that it actually drove people crazy to completely lack human contact for years on end, and those findings, those early findings, have been corroborated since then. We now know that solitary is very deleterious to people who are and any attempt to rehabilitate them, and yet we do it throughout the country, even to people in their formative years when it's most damaging to psychosocial development. So it's a big problem. It's something I saw a lot of at Manchester FCI.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've read it, but I'm sure you've heard of it. But the Mother Jones reporter who went undercover, yeah.
Yep.
Have you read that piece?
Yep, I have.
Okay. What do you think of that? Was that true to your experiences?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think it generally was. Solitary is, again, people are miserable in there, and people will, one example I talk about in the book is someone who stops up their toilet, and floods their own cell. Think about how miserable you have to be and how angry you have to be at the guards to flood your own cell with human feces just to try to make them clean it up. When in reality, they're not going to clean it up. They're just going to assign a bunch of inmates to do it. Mm-hmm. So, the misery, the human misery in solitary is indescribable, and the long-term damage that it wreaks on people's mental health is vast.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the thing that seems so cruel to me is that they don't even give you things to write on or any books or anything, right?
In solitary, where we were, once a week, they would bring by a mobile library with maybe 20 books, and I think you were allowed one book a week. So, that was, and I think you could have one pencil that was an inch long and one sheet of paper.
Mm. Yeah, that right there would drive you crazy. I mean, if you had all day to read, I could probably read more than one book a week. I'm sure you read a lot more in prison than you had before.
I did read a lot. I had a full-time job, which most people in prison do. You got to work 40 hours a week. I worked in a warehouse on a loading dock with other guys. We moved all the food that came into the compound that fed about 2,500 prisoners at two prisons in Manchester. So it was it was hard work, but at least it was something to do all day.
Yeah, but this goes back to you being, I think, kind of not targeted necessarily, but maybe targeted by people in charge, because you were somebody coming to this prison, and they knew you were writing a book, right?
They did.
Did you volunteer that information, or did they figure that out?
Well, they just saw that I was writing on napkins or toilet paper, little bits here or there, and that got them suspicious. And then a letter came in to the prison from a literary agent who was interested in representing me, and of course they intercept all the mail and read it. And once that happened, then they sent me to the warehouse to work. I think figuring that that would occupy me and wear me out enough that I wouldn't have much time, energy, or inclination to be writing.
Mm-hmm. And your notes, how you said
But,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, you hid these in other people's cells, right?
I did, because they pretty frequently swept my cell, come in and just tear it up and throw everything away. So I had to start hiding my notes in a different unit.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's hard enough writing a book when you're free, as I'm sure you know. But, yeah, wow, that's amazing. How did you get them out of the prison, though? How did you get these notes? You said at the end that they were destroyed in Hurricane Sandy, right?
They were. I got them out of the prison because another guy who I would steal onions and green peppers from the warehouse for him, in exchange for him storing my notes and then sending them to his brother on the outside. And he would send them to his brother, who would then send them to a friend of mine, who began to transcribe them.
Oh my gosh.
And the book ended up coming out in about 5 years after I left prison. Last fall. It's called Mr. Smith Goes to Prison, of course, not Washington, and ended up, it's not just about my experience in prison. It's a combination, as you know from reading it, a combination of stories about what prison is really like on the inside, mixed with policy analysis of what exactly is wrong with the American criminal justice system and practical solutions for fixing it.
Yeah, it's a great read because I feel like I learned a lot, but I also you got a really engaging story out of it too. So it works well together.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to read. It feels weird to say that about a book about prison, but I did enjoy it quite a lot.
Especially saying that to the guy who was in there.
But you have a very helpful chapter in the book about surviving prison, which I thought was very interesting. Because there was a book and then movie. I've seen the movie. I've not read the book, called Let's Go to Prison. But apparently the book was a very straightforward guy who went to prison, and this is how you can get along. And the movie was not, of course, but the movie was funny, but not, I'm sure, realistic. So how did you read anything before you went into prison on how to survive prison? No, you just winged it. Wow.
I winged it.
Huh. Because you seem like such a guy that would, prepare, for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I just feel like trusted that, I know it sounds crazy, but in a lot of ways politics and most of my life prepared me to survive prison.
Yeah, that's another thing I was going to say. You had a lot of natural advantages, I felt like, going into prison that I think served you very well. So
Yeah. First of all, I can play basketball and had played and coached my whole life, and that helped a lot. It's a little bit of fish out of water, being a former politician, a political science professor, and, a middle-class white guy. But having played basketball my whole life, that helped me kind of get to know people and earn people's trust that I was, a regular guy. It also helped that people had read in the newspaper that I hadn't worn a wire on anyone else.
Right.
Because other than a pedophile, the worst thing to be in prison is a snitch. Mm-hmm. So the fact that my best friend had worn a wire and I had not put me kind of in good stead,
right.
coming in. So those are a couple things that helped me. And I think generally speaking, being in politics, you got to learn how to be around people, especially in a district like mine, which was so diverse. You got to learn how to be around people who are different than you. And that's what prison is all about, is figuring out ways to blend in.
Right. Well, I even noticed in the documentary that your DAP was flawless, so I would stumble all over that. So, but the economy of prison is fascinating, I think, and you even did a TED Talk which talks about how, and it's kind of also included in the book, of course, how the prison economy is really not all that different from what you'd find in the straight business world, right?
Correct.
So what kind of concepts do you think match over between the two?
I heard just about every concept relating to capitalism described inside prison in somewhat different terms, but concepts like new product launch or quality control, supply chain management, territorial expansion. All of these concepts and many others were described in the parlance of the drug trade, as opposed to the way that you'd learn it at Harvard Business School. But these guys intuitively grasped all these concepts. The problem is that there was no training at all to help them turn their intuitive grasp of these sophisticated business concepts into any legitimate enterprise when they came home. And that's, I think, one of the biggest tragedies of our prison system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you even mentioned that some of the trades that people ply in prison they're not allowed legally to participate in on the outside world because you can't get a license for X, Y, or Z if you're a felon.
Exactly.
It's a real tyranny because it's like the one thing they can do. You know what I mean? And they've had plenty of time to perfect it, and they're probably pretty good at it. They just need some polishing up or whatever. But you can't even get your foot in the door with some of these laws. Ban the box is the same thing. Like you're not even going to get a call back a lot of places if you have felon on your record.
That's right. That's right. There's a lot of states where even something as simple as hair braiding, you're not allowed to get a hair braiding license if you've got a felony conviction. So there's similar laws in states all over the country with all types of professions, and we send people out of prison oftentimes with $10 and a bus ticket, and there is really almost no chance that a lot of these guys are going to be able to successfully reassimilate into society. 90% of employers perform criminal background checks. 85% of landlords perform criminal background checks. And in both cases, most employers and landlords will not hire or rent to anyone with a background. And so if you can't get a job and you can't find a place to live, the odds are that at some point you're going to have to resort to some type of criminal behavior to make enough money to eat and live. And by putting people coming out of prison behind the eight ball in this country, we ensure a sky-high recidivism rate that costs all of us billions of dollars in tax dollars that fund a revolving door back and forth and into our prisons.
Mm-hmm. And I think the way that you get conservatives on your side, and you even mentioned this a little bit in the book, is that, you actually praised, I think in the end of the book, Rand Paul on this point, more than anybody from the Republican side, because he's the one talking about, our prisons are full of, black and brown men, and we're just, this is all wasted talent, you know what I mean? And it's costing us money. I think that's the way you're going to get Republicans and fiscal conservatives and people like that, is that you're going to say, look, I mean, this is costing us all, and guess what? Unless you lock everybody up always forever, they have to come out sometime, so don't you want them to be able to rejoin society when they get out? Like, they have to live with us. We're all here, so.
Exactly, Rob.
Yeah. That wasn't really a question, so.
But you're right. I mean, 95% of people who are incarcerated in this country end up coming home. Mm-hmm. And if we've got a lot of research out there showing, for example, that every dollar we spend on correctional education programs returns over $5 back to taxpayers in reduced likelihood of recidivism and all the costs that relate to that. And yet, in most states, the educational programs are sparse and largely ineffective. So doing more to support high-quality educational and vocational training in prisons would have a huge payoff. It's just a hard thing for a lot of politicians to advocate for. And that's one of the things I'm focused on now, is to try to, help create a climate in St. Louis and in Missouri where policymakers can pay more attention to long-term outcomes resulting from our criminal justice system, instead of appealing to the lowest common denominator in the short term.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now back to the economy of prison, because it always amazes me how much how little prisoners get paid for the work they do, and that wouldn't be such a big deal, except private companies all the time make basically effectively free labor out of prisons. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my job working in the warehouse, I made about 3 cents an hour, $5.25 a month. To work full-time, moving about 40,000 pounds of food every day in and out of prison in 100-pound bags of rice, beans, flour, sugar. So you don't have any money coming in. I did. I was lucky relative to almost everybody else there. But most guys, especially because of our nation's civil asset forfeiture laws, if they were dealing drugs, their whole bank account gets cleared out. They're broke, and they got to buy their toothbrush, their toothpaste, their deodorant, their soap in prison, crappy products at prices marked up 40 or 50% over what you pay on the street. So guys figure out a way to hustle. Sometimes legal hustles inside prison, sometimes illegal hustles, trying to find a way to make a buck so they can survive. And that gives rise to a tremendous entrepreneurial ingenuity that I think, we need to do more to try to tap that when people come home.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, it almost makes you feel like it's like legalized slavery in some ways. It's so strange that it's exempt from every other wage law in the world that you can pay people this little. Yeah, but anyway, it's not, like you said, it's not even just what you get paid, it's what you have to pay to get anything. And I think you even mentioned where email was like, what, $6 an hour to like sit on the computer and compose
Correct.
Email? That is...
It would cost me a month's worth of wages to send emails for an hour.
I mean, you better get real good at typing, like fast.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So at the end of the book, this was another thing that I thought was really interesting. You said we have to re-examine how we deal with nonviolent, and then you even kind of pushed it to maybe even violent offenders, because the goal, I think you said, is to reduce the prison population in half by I don't remember what year.
2030.
2030, there you go. And that is going to have to, I mean, even if we let all the nonviolent, or as you call it, was it non, the 3 times? Yeah. So you let all those people go, and you still don't get to 50%, so you're going to have to institute some sort of home detention situation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, technology's gotten good enough that with electronic monitoring systems, we could save billions of dollars every year if we put nonviolent drug offenders in particular, but also those people who have hit, violent offenders who have hit the so-called criminal menopause. After the age of 45, people who are let out of prison who had committed a violent offense in their teens or early 20s are highly unlikely to ever do it again. In most cases, it was a crime committed in the heat of passion, and not one that's going to be replicated in a person's older, middle-aged or senior citizen years. And so, the fastest growing generational cohort in our prisons in America right now are members, people over 50. And it's a huge expense, particularly their healthcare costs inside prison cost our nation a fortune. And yet we're not really increasing public safety because these people aren't really any more likely than average citizens to commit a crime. So there's lots of innovative ways that we can either alternatively sentence people on the front end or compassionately release people who are unlikely to commit crimes on the back end without decreasing public safety, and we need to look into all those options. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you get the concept which you mentioned in the book about how the longer you're going to put people in prison, the more A, they're going to have to be criminals to make a living, and B, just they're going to be better criminals, of course. By who, what do you expect to happen? So I mean, exactly. It's ridiculous, but. So also in the epilogue of the book, you said that you wanted to start keeping in touch with the guys in prison you talked about in the book. Have you made any progress with that?
I have. I am in touch with 4 or 5 guys that I did time with, and, hoping to encourage them to advocate for some of the reforms that I'm advocating for, and that Concordance Academy, where I work, is going to be pushing over the next several years.
Oh, great. Very cool. And these are, how did they feel about their portrayals in the book?
I haven't talked to everybody who's in the book, but everybody is just no one is named by their real name in the book. They're named by their prison nickname, and so I don't think, hopefully nobody is too bothered.
Right. Well, hopefully they don't consider it some sort of informing or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. But like you said, you don't use any real names. I have no idea who these people are. So you talk about ways to reform the prison system, but we've talked a little bit about the influence of money, and it seems like making prisons profitable and having these private prison companies like is it CCA? Is that the one?
Yeah.
And Cisco, who does the food. It was always funny. We had Cisco was the food provider for the summer camp I worked at, and so the director would always joke that we were getting prison food, and now I know it's true. So they're everywhere, Cisco. But they're making bank. You're making a lot of bank. As you point that out in the book. The private contractors going in and out of the prison you talk about. How do you remove the profit motive from the prison system in your efforts to reform prison?
Well, I mean, first thing, we should look at for-profit prisons themselves, and these contracts that some of them sign with states and counties to basically house their prisoners or build prisons with a contract stipulating that the county or state must fill 95% of the cells for 20 or 25 or 30 years, those should be abrogated because it provides a perverse incentive for governments to make sure that a certain number of people are in prison, whether or not there's a sufficient number of people actually committing crimes. So that's the first thing we need to do. And secondly, we need to make sure that things like the Obama administration has done to reduce the cost of phone calls in prison, which could run up to $14 a minute before they were regulated last year. We've got to get rid of this profiteering, especially when the profiteering makes it harder for people to stay in touch with their loved ones, which is one of the few things we found can reduce recidivism upon reentry, is ensuring that people can be in touch with their family, their friends, their pastor. So we shouldn't let private companies' profit motives get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. Right, but then you also talk about the geographic kind of landscape as far as the where you were in Kentucky there, and the coal mining obviously had dried up. This was the major employer in town. There was really nothing. You said it was it the second poorest county in the country or something along those lines?
Yeah, one of the poorest. And the New York Times actually, which compiled a misery index, called it the most miserable county in America.
My goodness. So anyway, these people,
there's not a lot of jobs.
Yeah, precisely.
A lot of these counties where prisons are located in this country, most of the manufacturing jobs have left, and they don't really have any credible, sources of new economic development, and that's why they turn to prisons.
But what do you do for those people who, yes, it's bad that they work at a prison. I'm sure they'd rather work somewhere else. I'd like them to work somewhere else. But how do we get them, above water?
Yeah, I mean, there's no silver bullet. I surely don't have one, but there's a lot of smart people working on rural economic development. There's a lot of, seeing the explosion in renewable energy, the wind farms, the solar farms, solar energy, innovation. There's just a lot of different ways that we can add value in the agricultural sector that can help in rural areas. In some places like data centers, go into rural areas if there's caves and with a cool environment, and you can build these huge data centers that global multinational telecommunications firms can take advantage of. So there's, as I said, no single solution to the problems of some of these areas, but I can tell you what the solution is not, and that's more prisons.
Yeah, well, I agree with you there for sure. So have you given any thought to making your book into a movie?
There are a couple of people in Hollywood that are interested in potentially doing so, but we're in conversations with them. But there's nothing yet. So if anyone listening is interested and connected in Hollywood, then they should look me up, and I will put them in touch with my agent.
That's right. Make them an offer. But would you play yourself if that was an option? You would not?
I would not.
Why not?
Because they'd want a big name to play me. I'm not going to draw any audience in.
Who would you pick to play you then?
I don't know. It's a good question. Definitely have some people who, some actors who, a lot of students of mine over the last several years as I've been teaching have told me I looked like, but who knows? But I hope that it's something, it would be nice to see the book get, wider distribution. It's done very well as a book, but that doesn't compare to the kind of reach that a television show or a movie can have. And so hopefully it will turn into something.
Cool. Well, I hope so. I mean, it was definitely, I could see it totally being a movie. So if all this hadn't happened, say the complaint by Russ Carnahan's campaign had never happened, you'd gone about your political career. Where do you think you'd be right now as far as your political career? Where would you hope? What was your ultimate goal in politics?
It's pretty tough to say, but I think I was definitely interested potentially in running for mayor of St. Louis. And who knows where things would have gone, but I know that I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I feel blessed to be able to have come out of that experience whole, got a beautiful wife and 2 amazing children, and I got to see a side of society that very few people, frankly, who are highly educated and middle class in this country ever get to see. And so I'm trying to take that experience and do something good with it. And hopefully, in a few years, I'll have been able to do so.
Yeah, it's almost a shame that you were the one that had to go down, because it wasn't really like you needed to learn a lesson. You already knew that this was a bad thing, that we were doing mass incarceration or whatever. It almost seems like this should have happened to some Law and Order Republican. That, you know what I mean? Like that would have been a much more soul searching experience for them.
I hear you.
So, are you allowed to run for an office now that you're an ex-felon?
There's some I could run for, and there are others I'm prohibited from running.
Really?
For, but
okay.
I could tell you, the day I go down to the courthouse to file for office again, I will run into my wife down there filing for divorce. So.
She's not with it. Okay.
No.
But has being outside of politics now been freeing for you? Because you write very candidly in the book, and you do come across as very genuine in the documentary too. I don't mean that you were being fake at that point, but you do have to kind of put on a certain artifice or whatever when you're a politician campaigning and whatnot. But has being out of politics been freeing?
Absolutely. I obviously couldn't have written the book, or probably wouldn't have written the book quite as candidly as I did if I were still seeking electoral office. So, yeah, anytime you used to be in politics and then you're out and you don't have any ambition to get back in, you can be pretty candid about the process, warts and all, and that's what I tried to do in the book.
Right, absolutely. But what's the most annoying question that people ask you when they find out you've been to prison?
Did you get raped?
Right? You even have a part in the end where you're at like a dinner party or something, and some guy like manages to insert that in the conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to be asked that just anyway. You know what I mean? Like that's not something that people should ask other people in polite conversation. But you do admit, you talk about this happens. This is very real, and it's scary how it's these people that think that this is part of the prison experience, and it should be, because this adds to the harshness, because apparently in their minds prison is too cushy.
Yeah, I mean, in some people's minds, if you do something to get yourself into prison, then anything that happens there, deserve. And that's why I think one reason that we tolerate rape culture inside of prisons as a society, and it's unfortunate and very short-sighted, because many same people who are raped in prison come outside and in a tragic way attempt to reclaim their manhood in the same awful way that they perceive it was taken from them on the inside. So it's a really myopic view of our society to tolerate that.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Just horrifying. But switching to a lighter note, it's the second to last night of the Republican National Convention. I imagine it's been interesting as an ex-politician to watch this election season. What's it been like for you to see what's been happening?
It's embarrassing, I think, as an American to watch this convention and listen to some of the appeals to, that are, I think, misogynistic, xenophobic, racist, and unworthy in many cases of this country. So it's really sad to me, like what one component of the Republican Party has turned into. Or degenerated into, and so that's really my feeling more than anything. I'd love to see in America where Republicans and Democrats can get along and aren't constantly vilifying one another. That was how I tried to operate as a senator, and I'd love to see us get back to that as a country.
Yeah, I totally agree. Everybody's kind of in their own camps now, and it's pretty sad. But on a lighter note, we always talk about music. So what kind of music do you listen to?
Yeah, I listen to a lot of. I listen to everything from kind of 90s kind of alt rock, from when I was in college. Like, I love Weezer.
Oh, I love Weezer too. I've seen them 4 times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Huge Weezer fan. Everything from that to like rap, especially like old school rap, to like, country music. So I'm kind of all over the map.
Yeah, I agree. It's not really like what kind of music do you like. It's more like I just, is it good? I'll listen to anything that's good. So.
Yeah, I played drums in a band, and I played drums in the gospel choir in prison. So I love music, and I'm not that picky about what it is as long as I got music, kind of in my life.
Very cool. Well, is there anything else I didn't ask you about that you want to get out there?
Nope, but if people want to find me on Twitter, they can find me at, my handle is Jeff Smith Mo, as in Missouri, Jeff Smith M-O, and hopefully I will see people on Twitter. The book is called Mr. Smith Goes to Prison, and if you read it and enjoy it, please go on Amazon and write a review. If you read it and you don't like it, then just forget about it.
Take the day off. But thank you so much for being a guest here, and I appreciate you taking the time. And it was a really great book to read. I really mean that, and it was fun talking to you. So,
well, fun talking to you too, Rob. Thanks so much for having me on, and take care.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.